All right, guys. Thanks very much for having me. This talk is slightly less technical than the other ones, but it kind of goes into the nuts and bolts of how EU affects our policies. Our policies affect us as companies and small businesses across the EU. And I myself, as a small business, coming from being just a MikroTik network admin to then knocking on the door of EU institutions saying, hey, small guys count too. So this is what the talk's about. I'd just like to thank the MTPC World organisers, Jaromir, Ron and Lorenzo, for having me here. In fairness, they don't know what I'm about to say, and being honest, probably being frank, I don't know what I'm about to say, so we'll keep going. My name is Thomas Smyth, for those of you who don't know. I'm an owner and network operator, Wireless Connect Limited, set up to give broadband in rural areas in Tipperary in Ireland. Without MikroTik, my company would not have succeeded. In some ways, we've outgrown some of the MikroTik features, and in many ways, we still use a lot of the MikroTik equipment in sweet spots on our network. And I've become a volunteer representative of small, medium enterprise internet service providers in Ireland and the EU. And I've also collaborated with Lorenzo, an ASO provider, in co-authoring papers to the European Commission trying to change the policies in the EU that affect us. I also work with other SME bodies like ASO provider in Italy, and I try to maintain the NSH port, network shell port in OpenBSD, and we fund the development of network shell for OpenBSD through Wireless Connect, and we use OpenBSD quite extensively. In terms of what do we use MikroTik in our company, we've used it for obviously BGP route looking glasses. So we use it for looking at the routes table because obviously a lot of our network engineers are familiar with the MikroTik user interface. We use it for obviously the management. It's quick and dirty network management. We probably don't use it optimally, so I'm looking forward to learning from you guys later on in the presentation. We also use a lot of tunneling, and in fairness, you can see from MikroTik, the tunneling options in MikroTik is nearly endless, and we use it for firewalling and proof of concept development. If you want to lab up something quickly, like, I have an idea, we often use MikroTik as the development platform to do that. In terms of OpenBSD, we've used it for OpenBGPD. So OpenBSD is a Unix, it's a BSD family. And we've used the packet filter for the firewalling, and we also use OpenBGPD, which is a really, really capable BGP router. What we use is to complement MikroTik's BGP feature set. So if you're, sometimes BGP MikroTik can have struggles with lots of peers. So what we have actually done is offloaded some of the MikroTik BGP stuff to OpenBSD and OpenBGPD. Which is used on some of the largest internet exchanges in the world. And so you can actually harness that performance and stability from OpenBSD and OpenBGPD. And that for us was a big change for us to actually supplement MikroTik. So use MikroTik where it's strong, and then use OpenBGPD where it's strong also. I'll just skip that, but I just want to get, but we've also used, let's say, OpenBSD because it's secure. Stable. So for DNS servers for our ISP, we use it quite, and it's, you don't really have to do that much with it once it's working, and that's what I like about it, because the less time I'm working on my network, the more time I'm spending in Europe arguing with politicians and commission officials, which is a win-win for my company and the people I represent. In terms of network shell, just to briefly say, it's this kind of a Cisco-like interface for OpenBSD. So if you have network engineers who are adverse to using Linux or BSD, it creates a kind of a predictive command line shell that's similar to a Cisco interface for OpenBSD. So it makes it just a little bit easier for your network engineers. And we've kind of done a fair bit of development on it. It's still nowhere near where we want it to be, but it's certainly one worth trying out. So I'd encourage you to try it out and give me feedback on how much you think it sucks. So please do, and happy to take criticism or suggestions. In terms of the EU, what happens with the EU that I see is that we often are faced with, let's say, GDPR, which I think everyone loves. Hands up who loves GDPR and how it makes our lives so much better. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Crickets. Yeah. So the reason, but that there was a whole policy formation process on GDPR that most of us are not even aware of, and then it just lands, and then it's like, oh, this is the law, and you have to comply with it. And the thing is, as small businesses, we can actually influence that law before it becomes law. And that's something that I'd like you all to reflect on and your customers to reflect on. But if you don't complain and you don't tell the politicians and the officials about problems with proposed laws, when they come and affect you, you have no real right to complain because you never told them in the first place. So what I'd say is meet early and meet often. Your officials, like your local MEPs and officials, when they're asking, when you hear of a change in rules, it's important to engage with the European authorities. And that's something that I learned perhaps a little bit too late. And I've been playing catch up for the last 6 years because of that. And in terms of the EU, I'm just going to briefly go through where things can change in the EU and how you can actually impact on it. So the European Union is built on, there's a Charter of Fundamental Rights. So it's a series of treaties and steps. But the Charter of Fundamental Rights, everyone has them. It's a small document, it's only 17 pages. Then you've obviously the EU member states, there's 27 member states, pooled sovereignty, so we all exchange something in exchange, we give up some sovereignty in exchange for access to the internal market, and hopefully we all make a few more quid and our standards of living grow as a unit. It's based on treaties, so the most fundamental one is the Treaty of the European Union, TEU, and as you can see it's only about 34 pages of law, so it's quite simple. And these are just the basic fundamental, and these are agreed at high level at 4 a.m. in Brussels, and they're all knackered, and they kind of say, okay, so it's not updated that often. I think the last time it was updated was the Maastricht Treaty, and that was in 1993, if I remember correctly. And then so you can see then there's the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, so it codifies what was in the fundamental principles of the treaties of the Union. And then after that, you have procedural regulations. So for every article, like each line of any of the treaties, then there's another page of documents that goes, this is actually what we mean by this article. So in terms of the European institutions, you've got the Commission. It's probably one of the most important ones. It's important because it could change the direction of the EU. So the 27 commissioners in the College of Commissioners, they can initiate acts to change what they're going to do. So for instance, you're seeing at the moment they're discussing today in Brussels a new defence pact, and they're talking about the defence. So the commissioner is saying, hey, let's spend more money in defence because of a troublesome neighbour to the east and an unreliable partner to the west. So the commission starts that process off. But then the Council of the European Union, that's where the member states can stop it. So obviously the member states wanted the ability to say, whoa, hey, don't move too far to the left or right. EU, you have to, each member state has an ability to stop it. And then obviously you've got various European councils, and so you'd have a Defence Council, an Economics Council, Finance Council. You probably have heard of all these different ones, the Foreign Affairs ones as well. And that's where the individual ministers from different briefs, the justice ones as well, they would all shape how the legislation. So when the Commission kick off a new initiative, like the Digital Networks Act, which is coming in at the end of the year, the people who are responsible for that, so the Digital Networks Act would be under communications, and it's relevant to all of us. That would be done by the communications ministers as well. So they would then negotiate with, the member states would negotiate with the Commission to try and shape that policy. And then there's the European Parliament. So anything that gets approved, so started by the Commission, approved by the Council, then gets, the European Parliament then gets a say on whether it passes. So it actually has to pass the European Parliament. And the European Parliament can amend acts as well. So that's where, but they're at the last hurdle. So it's already the juggernaut as well and underway. And also just to point out, in terms of the European Parliament, the Commission, so you have 27 members of the Commission. Each one is nominated by one of the member states. They have an oath to put the EU first. They swear an oath, so they're not actually individual from each. So they're meant to act as for the EU and the EU only. And some of them even do that, which is amazing. But then you've got the Council, as I said. That's the member states can put the brakes on any initiative they don't like from any of the commissioners. In terms of the EU Parliament, there's 720 MEPs, and you think that's a lot compared to 27 member states or 27 commissioners. But the problem they have is that there's thousands of people who work for the Commission, and there's only a couple of thousand of people who might work for the MEPs. So there's actually the imbalance that you can have the Commission create loads of legislation, and the oversight of that legislation is left to relatively few people. And so that's just something that's important. If you're ever doing it if you're ever talking with the MEPs about something, you should talk to everyone, including people you would never vote for. I remember being a former minister of Europe who was working in Europe to help companies like myself. He just said, Tom, don't be selective about who you talk to. He says, remember this, every MEP has something you and I don't have. And I said, what was that? And he says, a mandate. People have voted him into the parliament or her into the parliament. So even if you detest what they say on, let's say, immigration or something like that, they still have a vote for communications. So you should still always keep your options open when you're talking to people. You might be, so some people might be very right-wing and some people might be very left-wing, and you may be preferring centred policies like myself. You should still talk to them, because if you have some common interests, you can actually shape policies. So that's just really important. The part of the European Parliament that's really important is the committees. So you have 24 different committees. So each committee, you could have a Foreign Affairs Committee, you'd have a Communications Committee. And they're the people who actually scrutinise the legislation. So the committees will first scrutinise legislation coming from the Commission, and they're the core people you need to talk to when the new laws are being passed. It is becoming more important, the amount of laws that are coming down from the EU, and the problem is a lot of the time it just happens before we actually get a chance because we're not aware of it. I would probably blame the mainstream media for this, that most of certainly in the case in Ireland, the focus is generally on national issues and they don't really cover new policies coming down from the European Commission. They'd only really talk about crises like, the Ukraine crisis, which is very unfortunate. And they would talk about, let's say, defense, but they don't really talk about the new laws that will come in 5 years' time that are started today and that you need to actually impact. And the problem we have is that a lot of the big companies are aware of this and they have people paid to stay in Brussels and monitor that. And so if you can imagine, the Commission and the EU officials are all flying a plane, and all the instruments they're saying is help solve these problems for these big companies. And that's all they're hearing. They're being bombarded constantly by this. And to be fair to the Commission, I would say that I've found them to be open, that if you are, as a small business, worried about a piece of legislation, they would be more than happy to meet you if you write a fairly coherent letter that's something relevant to what they're dealing with. And I think it's important. If we look at the EU, so there's communications from the Commission. That's the stuff that you can count on is guidelines, like let's say, for instance, state aid investments. So the guidelines give you an idea of what rights you have as a business operating in the EU. And you've got directives then, which obviously give you rights, and then responsibilities. So for instance, you've got the Electronics Communications Code, you've got NIS1 and NIS2, which are the network, for securing your networks. GDPR, pain in all of our arses, sorry, excuse my language, but and then you've got the Cyber Security Act, the Digital Services Act, and the Digital Markets Act. And at the end of the year, you'll have the Digital Networks Act. So the Digital Networks Act is one that's really important for yourselves because they want to reform, let's say, telecoms regulation, and that'll affect a lot of your customers. Some of it's very positive, like they want to try and harmonize spectrum allocation across the EU. One area that I've been working quite hard on is upper 6 gigahertz. So if any of you who are using Wi-Fi 6 and 7, the 6 gigahertz spectrum in the EU is only about, it's in the lower half. It's half of what they get in the States. Okay, so 1/3, sorry. Okay, thank you. So you've got, so in terms of where the States have from 5.9 to 7.1, so they have 1200 megahertz of spectrum. We only have a few hundred megahertz of spectrum in the lower half of the band. And they're debating whether or not to give it to the mobile guys. So the mobile guys always say, we want more spectrum for 5G, 6G, etc., etc. And in fairness, the EU Commission have always been consistent in trying to give more license-exempt spectrum to make it easier for people to roll out. The problem is spectrum auctions can delay things, and that's done by member states. So member states still try to milk the cash cow of spectrum. And so they're trying to reform that, which is really good. There's other aspects of it, which the DNA, which I'd be worried about, which is network fees and network share. The reason why I'd be worried about it as an ISP is, as a small ISP, my ability to monetize. Basically, what happens is big telcos, since time began, have always been saying we need to be paid twice to do our job. So they want to be paid by the user for access to the internet, and then they want to be paid by the content providers for giving content. The problem I see with that is if you develop an internet access platform, you're selling a gigabit. It's a bit disingenuous to say I'm giving you a gigabit internet access when really you're saying, well, I'm only giving you gigabit internet access if I'm paid twice on the back end as well. And the problem from a selfish point of view as a small ISP is that my ability to make money off the big content providers is very minimal compared to a bigger ISP, where they have lots of lawyers and can get that. And what we see then is, what I'm concerned about is the distortion of the market, where they say, well, Google are paying me a fortune, or let's say big telco a fortune for access to their customers. And so they can depress the internet access price. That's the big issue I see. And then, of course, it drives the smaller competitors like me out of the market. I'd rather it be done based on, well, if it's a gigabit, charge cost plus reasonable margin for the gigabit internet access and do it like that. And it's been going on, and it's not the most scientific debate, but they scream the loudest. They have the biggest lobbyists there. And it's, what I see it as a further distortion of the market against the small guy. And it's something that I've been campaigning quite hard against. And also then there's the technical consequence. It's like, well, if we keep fragmenting the internet like this and start putting toll gates on the internet, where does that end, I think we've all benefited from the open internet standards as they are, and it's something that we've been fighting to keep the internet open, and that, each internet service provider can compete on a level playing field and say, well, I'm giving you a good quality gigabit internet access regardless of what website you're looking at. In terms of me, how I started this case was, and this is one that's very important for you, because the Commission is obviously, and the European and the member states all want more fibre rolled out in each country, and that is to be celebrated. But it's important that that's done in a way that doesn't harm small businesses who are already competing in the market. So I started this journey 6 years ago. A lawyer said, hey, read this document, and it was basically a communication from the Commission. So from a legal point of view, communication from the Commission is the Commission trying to codify a policy. And when they do that, they're binding themselves to that. So if they deviate from that, that creates a liability for them. As in, if you're a small business being affected by that, you could actually take them to court if they're doing something against your interests. So this one was about the application of state aid rules in broadband networks. So it's great, money is being pumped into networks around the world, around Europe, that's great. The problem is that if you already have invested in infrastructure and then a competitor gets money to overbuild your infrastructure, that's unfair. And so they try to, in fairness, and when you see the documentation from the Commission, you can actually see the policies. That's one thing, while, the likes of Boris Johnson would slag off the Commission for being too bureaucratic, when you actually go to see the documents, they're quite transparent. And you can actually see what rules you could expect to be applied in your area or not. For me, I befriended the lawyer, and the Irish authorities decided to put fibre in Ireland. And they did it basically a bit unfair. There's about 30 companies similar to us. We did a mapping exercise. We used LiDAR data to map how good line of sight we had between our base stations. So we had 28 companies with about 1,500 sites across Ireland, serving about over 100,000 subscribers. We submitted the mapping data, and of course, the Irish government said, nah, no, we were still going to pay an American businessman €3 billion to overbuild you. And so that was where I started this journey to the European Union to say, hang on, this is not fair, it's infringing my rights. Problem with member states is they work very closely with the Commission, and sometimes they might tell a fib. So this is from Yes Minister. It's a brilliant series from the UK, but it's the most sarcastic series. But as one of my friends who worked in the Irish government said, it's strangely accurate, though. He says, so they've been well informed about how cynical some civil servants can be. So we started to complain. So if you're ever infringed by a state aid rule like that, the people you need to talk to is DG Competition Unit C4. I'll explain how I got to that in a second. You can warn them. So if what I would say is warn the Commission early and often. If you see a deviation between, that's impacting you, you don't even have to be that specific about it. It does help, of course, to be specific. But you can safely say, if you think, like for instance, one civil servant in Ireland said got all the telcos into the room, all small ISPs, he goes, there's a train coming down the track, get off and get out of the way. We're going to put fibre everywhere. And that was, and I can tell you that is the exact opposite of what the EU policy was, which was to say, no, we'll only intervene where there's market failure. So state aid is about intervening where you have a market failure and to solve it, as opposed to ploughing through and killing off a load of small businesses. And now, I suppose, so now I'm representing about 20 small ISPs across Ireland in complaints about that policy in Ireland, and to try and get a fair deal for small businesses. So who can help? Well, you have to find the Director General for the area concerned, the Commission Service. So the Commission has two tiers. There's Commission Service, which is like your civil servants, and then you got the Commission College, or the political people in the Commission. You've got competition markets, which is important. So if you have that, you've got DG Comp, or DG Competition, and it's under Executive Vice President Ribera. So there's two classes of commissioner. There's normal commissioners, and then there's EVPs, or Executive Vice Presidents. And generally, they're the more senior ones. DG Connect and DG Grow, they're under the Internal Market Commissioner. I'm not going to pronounce, she's the Finnish lady, and I just can't pronounce her name to save my life, so I'm not going to try it. And then you've got the cabinets. And each commissioner then has their own cabinet, which is like a cabinet of a country, like a ministerial cabinet, where you can actually meet people with various responsibilities under each commissioner. Because as you can imagine, for all the policies that are in trade in the EU, the commissioner in their area, they'll actually have multiple experts underneath them to advise them. So there's an organization chart for any DG Comp. And so for instance, here you can see the Executive Vice President at the top, then you got the Director General, and then you've got, let's say, all the various different units underneath, and each one has a specific function. Most of them are kind of more relevant for dealing with the member states, but some of them would directly affect you. And so you can, what's brilliant about this is if you go DG Comp, you Google DG Comp organizational chart, you'll get a list of people who may be able to help you, and you can contact. That's an important thing. And so, for instance, for me, this one is very relevant for any of you working in the internet space. So you've got markets and cases, information technology, communications, media. So you've got state aid. So Christoph Kuik, which I'm a pen pal of for the last 6 years. But then also we've got antitrust. So if you see a competitor acting unfairly in the market, like trying to shut you out, let's say preventing you from selling their products, or you could actually talk to these guys and you can report it. I will warn you, you have to be honest with them. If you're not, you open yourself up to liability. So if you mislead them, or you can actually get prosecuted for it. So it's not a kind of thing where you use it to shank a competitor to, initiate a false investigation. But what you can do is alert the Commission, and the Commission do have a responsibility, and they take it pretty seriously, to try and keep the market, the internal market playing field level. And being honest, I've met about 5 of the people on that list, and it's, if someone like me just writing a letter saying I'm worried about network fees, I'm worried about the open internet, I'm worried about internet standards not being followed, they're the people you want to talk to. And they will actually take it on board. And they'll ask you questions, they'll give you time. So and it does help, especially when you're trying to form policies. So that's on the competition side, to protect your business or your customers' business interests. Then obviously DG Connect. DG Connect would be, let's say if we move away from competition, but you talk about policies. So how do you develop communications in Brussels and in your own locality? So we've got the Connect A section, which deals with artificial intelligence. I put that in there for the hype, sorry. And then we've got DG Connect B, which is all about connectivity. So Camilla Klock is the director in charge of it. B1, Peter Stuckman, I met him 2 weeks ago. And they're dealing with the policy formation for new policies. So these guys set in train policies that will hit you in 3 to 4 years' time. So it's what I would say is engage early, engage often. And this guy, Gerasimus, he's Greek. I won't pronounce his surname, but he's a very nice guy. I met him at the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance and at the World Wi-Fi Congress. And he's in charge of policy formation for spectrum in the EU. So the key thing with what I would say is engage early and often, and these organizational charts will help you map how to get there. The EU might not necessarily always help. So this is a letter dated, it was published on the 20th of December, and it's where they said, sorry, Tom, you're wrong, the member state is right, and there's nothing wrong with the state aid intervention in Ireland. So that was what happened to me. And so the question is, what happens when you disagree with the EU? Who could you go to? So you could potentially go to this fella, or this guy, he's very popular recently, or their boss. And but all joking aside, if you do have difficulty with the policy that's been implemented, you can always go, specifically affecting you, you can go to the EU Ombudsman. Now, to be clear, it's only for EU institutions. So if your member state implements a policy like a government department in your own country, they're not the guys to go to. But if the Commission do, these are the guys to talk to. It's free, it's non-binding. What I mean by that is they can embarrass the Commission into doing something, but the Commission can still have a brass neck and rough it out. Now, generally, the Commission will try to comply with the Ombudsman, but where it's politically sensitive or there's too much money involved, they won't. What will happen is the Ombudsman will say, we think the Commission is wrong. The Commission will say, noted, we think you're wrong, and we're going to carry on as normal. But generally, if you are adversely affected, you can get compensation, and the relative resolution time frame compared to other EU stuff is reasonably quick at about 3 to 9 months, depending on the case. That's just a sample, but that's what they reckon is the timeline to correct it. If you have a very complex case, it'll probably take longer. But the thing is, it's accessible. You don't have to pay anything. If you are affected by an EU decision, you also have the General Court. It's costly. It costs about 20 to 100,000 euro. It's binding-ish because it can be overturned by the European Court of Justice. Generally, the types of decisions can be affected. So the one where I got the Commission wrote to me and said, dear, they wrote to the member state, but they talked about my complaint specifically. I'm entitled to challenge that in the General Court because it affects me directly and it's addressable. So I have standing. So having standing is kind of tricky. And really, you can, like if they ban something that your company produces, and you're the only company in the world that produces it, and they only ban, let's say you create this chemical. So there's a history where Pfizer were the only people in the world to create a chemical that was being banned. And they were not allowed to access the court because they said, well, theoretically, anyone could make the chemical. They're not just, but the only people in the world making that chemical were thrown out of court saying you don't actually have standing because they're just banning the chemical. They're not specifically addressing you as a company. So, but where the decisions are made, so if they grant, for instance, in your country, you get a fibre rollout and you feel that you're being overbuilt unfairly, when the Commission approve that aid, you have a 2-month time limit to challenge those decisions in the General Court. And or if you go to the Commission, you make a complaint and they don't uphold it, you can challenge that within 2 months as well. Then it goes to the European Court of Justice, and that's the big daddy of all, so their decisions are final. Member states could go directly. You could only go to the ECJ after going to the General Court, okay? So there's a second step for all the normal mere mortals like ourselves. And again, addressable decisions can be challenged and need to have standing. In terms of improving policies, and this is an important thing, is REFIT. REFIT is your friend. And what it is what they're trying to do is REFIT is an acronym, and it's like Regulatory Effectiveness Toolkit. I forget the acronym. But they try to base their policies on evidence, okay? The problem is you can have a lot of people, quite frankly, bullshitting them and putting bullshit evidence in. And so you have to try and fight that a bit as well. But they have to do an impact assessment, and that's your friend. The impact assessment is where if they change a law to make your life a bit more difficult, they have to accurately document how that would make your life more difficult and what they're going to do to offset that. So they have this principle called one in, one out. And you've probably heard of simplification being the order of the day, and it's something that we do all as small businesses need to push. But so if the EU add a new burden for you as a small business, they also have an obligation to remove a burden that exists already. Now, sometimes they get it right and sometimes they get it wrong. For instance, with the Cybersecurity Act, they said, look, it's going to be a lot more work to comply, but, people will trust this businesses more because they're complying with this act. And I was like, well, if you're a small business and you're serving your neighbors, chances are you already have that trust. So they say, oh, we're going to give you trust, but we're going to give you a load of burden. But really, they're giving you something you already had anyway. And so sometimes the impact assessments are not that well created. And that's where you have to challenge that. And you can talk to your MEPs. And the MEPs are heavily involved in that stage. And so it's important to push back on that. In terms of getting information, you can ask the EU. It's a free service. And if you're worried about something, they will direct you to who. So if you're lost and don't know, you can ask your perm reps. Your local EU Commission office in your capital city usually has a local Commission office who are obliged to help you engage with the European Commission. And then you've got the permanent reps they're like basically the embassies in Brussels of each country. So you can actually talk to them. And each government department of every member state has a person in Brussels who can help you and should be able to help you. And sometimes you can be lucky that your member state agrees with you. In case of the state aid complaint I made, it was against the member state, so they weren't going to offer me too much help, unfortunately. But that's life. But then there'll be other things where a national interest thing will affect you. So if you're sufficiently big, or you're manufacturing equipment in the EU, for instance, you can actually get help from your member state, because obviously your member state wants to improve employment and stuff like that. So if there's a new policy coming into the EU that affects your ability to manufacture in your member state, that's where your member state can really help out. So it's about trying to make contacts, join maybe an internet association or an ISP association or an association for your business. You can sign up to the transparency register, and when you do that, you can also sign up to the Have Your Say portal. So the Have Your Say portal is basically where the Commission will email you when they're thinking about changing something. It's a double-edged sword because they'd like to change everything all the time. So you will be filling out surveys for the rest of your life. But the problem is if you don't fill out those surveys and then the laws come in 6 years' time, well, you're kind of screwed. So at least if you actually totally disagree with a policy, you can put it in. And what's really nice about that is that they have to somehow change so when you say, I think this is a really bad idea, you could watch with some amusement how they try to change your answers to say, well, actually, he agrees, I think, So often they'll ask a question like, do you somewhat agree with this process, or do you not agree at all? Or, they might have, do you not really agree, or do you agree, or do you strongly agree? And they go, well, they somewhat agree. So they won't say not really agree, they say somewhat agree. So that'll be the option. And you were like, but I wanted the no, like this is bullshit option. So sometimes that can be hard to find. So that's where I'd just be wary, because they will try to do a statistical analysis on it and say, well, and I've seen it where, they said a majority of the respondents thought the system worked well. And it was like, well, actually we said it kind of worked. We didn't say it worked well, but they actually managed to shoehorn it. If you have any questions about EU policy stuff, help me help you. Like you can email me at tom.smyth@wirelessconnect.eu, and particularly if you want to join the fight for more spectrum for Wi-Fi, that's one of the things that we've been fighting for fixed wireless. Keeping the internet open with open standards. So rather than creating very narrow telco-based standards that would actually make it harder for people to expand the internet in their localities, we're saying, well, look, just keep it open. Like the internet as it stands is quite beautiful. You give RIPE a few grand, and suddenly you have your own AS number, and you can, get 2 transit providers, and suddenly you can expand the internet in your own area. And we're also trying to, just if you're worried about, let's say, the bigger companies getting an unfair advantage, either with state aid, which they are making it easier. So if the Irish model is anything to go by, I would say if you're a small internet provider in Europe, you better watch out. And that's where I'd say keep an eye on the state aid rules. Like one of the examples where I would say you can have this creeping state aid rules, just as a small example, is they could announce a small measure that's below, there's a minimum threshold, and I think it's about 10 million. So anything below 10 million, the EU don't really care about. It's like chicken feed, okay? So your member state can announce 10 million investment to your competitor in your area, and that's technically fine. But what you can do is they can then say, oh, that was great. Now we're going to double it, and we're going to expand it to other areas. And suddenly now the quantum of state aid is far above 10 million, or what they call the de minimis threshold. And so you can then, you as an affected party can let the Commission know, hang on a second, this started off as a really small project, but it grew legs and now it's actually threatening my business. When that happens, where there's 2 redresses there. One, the Commission could tell the member state, stop investing in the competitor until we do an investigation. And if they reverse, if they actually ban the aid, your competitor would be forced to repay it. That is rare, being honest, particularly if there was approved aid, but it is one of the redresses available. But if you're not informing the Commission about your market conditions or unfair practices, and it can be anything, it can be a policy that, for instance, you're banned from operating in an area because you didn't get a license, but your competitors are, and you've similar capabilities. It's not just all about money going to your competitor. It could be the conditions where your competitors are allowed to operate, but you're not. So state aid can also just be giving other people a head start procedurally. So for instance, when you have to build a base station, you have to have loads of planning permissions and stuff like that. But the competitor, because he's owned by the national organization, can erect anything. That would be a form of state aid as well. So they're the kind of things that we would say you need to just keep an eye on. But look, if you're not pushing the needle a little bit early on, it's very hard to fight it once it becomes law and it comes back in. And that's the thing. And I do think small business matters. The 20 or so companies that I've been representing formally in the commission, they matter. The 33 Irish ISPs who support me on the 6 gigahertz stuff and the open internet standards and the network fees debate, they matter, and you matter. And so what I'm trying to say is, look, we think the deck has been stacked against small internet providers around Europe. And if you're not in fighting and just saying, hey, we are here, we exist, and the policies need to serve us as well, not just the big guys like Deutsche Telekom, Vodafone, Telefonica, all them. You know, they're important players, but they're not everyone. They're not us, you know. And for us, I'd have to say one thing that does give me hope is that when you do write a letter to the commission officials and MEPs, if they're interested in that area or they think they can do something, and sometimes they don't know. Like I remember writing to someone and they said, this really isn't my area of expertise. And what I was trying to warn the person about was, well, no, hang on, your commissioner is responsible for data protection in Europe. And so when the new rules come in to try and push, let's say, data away from the European Union, that'll affect the people's privacy in Europe, and that's your commissioner's responsibility. And so once you explain to them why you want to meet them, they'll meet you, and they'll be very open, and they will actually help out. And I think in some small way, I'd like to think over the past few years that we've been able to impact some of the policies. Unfortunately, not all the way. Like, they don't do everything I say, which I think they should, but they don't realize it's my world and they just live in it, but we're still working on that. But yeah, what we do matters, and that's what I would say. So if you have any questions, I'll take it now. And if you have any questions, like if you disagree with any of the policies I was saying, or you want any questions, please ask me now. And I'd like to just thank you for your attention. And sorry, I know it's not the most technical presentation. I'll prove that I am technical at the bar if you buy me beer. And I might even buy you one back. But yeah, so if any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Any question?
I know you're out there. I can hear you breathing.
Yes, we have one.
Yes.
Hi, Tim Porter from Zycom. You started off your talk about offloading BGP onto OpenBSD system.
Yeah.
Just wondered if you could talk for a couple of minutes just on that, pros and cons, and any pitfalls. Yeah,
so OpenBSD is very secure, very stable. It's not the fastest at packet forwarding. And so what we did was we used it similar to root servers in an internet exchange point. So we had our feeds, we had multi-hop BGP sessions going into our OpenBSD routers. The OpenBSD routers then filtering and summarizing those route tables and then dumping them into what we have at our main, let's say, forwarding and edge routers are actually Arista-based. And so we dump in a summary of the internet table. So just to give you an idea, there's about 20,000 prefixes from /20, sorry, about 20,000 prefixes from /21 to /8 in length, IPv4 prefixes on the internet. On our local internet exchange, there's about 80 to 90,000 prefixes, okay? So on a typical Arista router, where you have a limited TCAM, you might only have 200,000 entries that are allowed. So we actually peer directly on the Arista routers of the core and the MikroTiks. And then what we do is we actually summarize the route table with our transit providers. So we have a default route going in. We have, and so anything from a /21 to a /8 is directly on the TCAM. And then anything from /21, let's say to /24, is just summarized by a default route, except for the ISP traffic, the IXP, the Internet Exchange Point ones, which would obviously there'd be a load of /24s. For instance, Google's 8.8.8.0/24, very important prefix to have reachable, or 1.1.1.0/24 for Cloudflare's DNS. And so they would come directly into the MikroTik or the Arista routers. And so and it also just, you had that stability of, where you had what's really nice about the OpenBGPD was it got funding, the OpenBSD project got funding from RIPE to make it more stable and to make it more scalable. And so there's been a very strong focus on security and stability on the route filtering engine and stuff like that. And so where your tables are, where your MikroTik routers are struggling with larger tables, what I would say is you could actually offload it to a root server. You still have your MikroTik doing the forwarding, but the decision engines are actually are being summarized by the OpenBSD boxes and just dump it in, like with an IBGP session with the OpenBGPD routers. The key thing is not to have it in the path. So if you can imagine, it's like a dog leg off. So the OpenBGPD routers don't actually route any traffic. There's that's the key benefit. It's kind of a play on what Internet Exchange Points would do, where you have, a load of peers connected to a switch. They're all exchanging traffic directly, but they're only talking to the root servers to exchange the network reachability information. Does that answer your question? I could go through, there's actually a talk I gave at BSD CAN. So if you do OpenBGPD ISP routers on YouTube, there'll be a BSD CAN presentation where I actually go into detail with that.
Thanks for that. I'm just wondering, for the case where you might have a MikroTik at the edge, do you take those full tables and offload them to the OpenBSD, which then summarizes it back again, or do you take the feed directly?
So we do a multi-hop BGP session from the transit provider to the OpenBGPD router. And we obviously have the transit provider has a static route effectively pointing to our MikroTik box, to our loopback.
You're just forwarding the BGP updates.
So you're forwarding the BGP signaling up, and then I have an iBGP session with the two route reflectors, the OpenBGPD route reflectors, and it's an iBGP session is what's taking the feed. And so, and what's really nice about that is the filtering mechanisms in OpenBGPD are amazing. Like they are built for scale. The large Internet Exchange Points use OpenBGPD. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands of peers. So the filtering is, in my opinion, far more reliable than, let's say, the MikroTik filtering for BGP filters. But because it's an iBGP session, it's quite straightforward for the MikroTik to handle it. Yeah.
Other questions?
Go on. I promise I don't bite. You sure? No?
In the previous presentation, no one raised the hand when the presenter asked, who are using Telnet? Everybody's using. No one. Just 3.
You never use Telnet.
No,
you're too
never.
secure. Any other questions? No? You sure?
Yes, you can talk with Tom in the 2 days. This is beautiful to be here live.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you, Tom, for your presentation.
Mille grazie.
It is more interesting than...
Thanks again. Sure.